Jake was 2 days from dying in the desert when his injured mare forced him toward a hidden canyon that saved his life. Beside the stream that would keep him alive sat enough stolen gold to change his future forever, and the skeleton of a man who had already died for it. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the red rock canyons of southern Utah, turning the dusty trail into a furnace that shimmered with heat waves. Jake Harrison wiped the sweat from his brow with a threadbare handkerchief, squinting against the glare as he surveyed the barren landscape stretching endlessly before him. At 28 years old, he had known poverty all his life, but these last few months had tested him in ways he never imagined possible. His stomach had been empty for 2 days now, his canteen held barely enough water for another afternoon, and his only companion, a sorrel mare named Copper, was limping badly from a stone bruise she had picked up 3 miles back. He dismounted carefully, feeling the stiffness in his own legs from days of hard riding. The worn soles of his boots had holes that let the scorching sand burn his feet with each step, but complaining about it would do no good. Jake had learned long ago that the frontier respected action, not words, and right now he needed to figure out how to get himself and Copper to the next town before they both collapsed from exhaustion and thirst. He ran his calloused hand along the mare's injured leg, feeling the heat radiating from her swollen fetlock. She flinched slightly but trusted him enough to stand still while he examined the damage. Copper had been his father's horse before the fever took him last spring, and she was the only thing of value Jake had left in this world. Well, that and his father's old revolver, which he kept tucked in his belt, more out of sentiment than any real expectation of needing it. His father, Tom Harrison, had been a ranch hand all his life, moving from spread to spread wherever work could be found, never quite managing to save enough to buy his own piece of land. Jake had followed in those same footsteps, working cattle drives and breaking horses for wealthy ranchers who paid just enough to keep a man fed and moving, but never enough to get ahead. The last ranch where he had worked, the Triple Creek spread near the Colorado border, had let him go when the owner's son returned from back east with new ideas about efficiency and cost-cutting. 15 men had lost their positions that day, all of them experienced hands who knew cattle and horses better than they knew their own names. Jake had taken his final pay, $42 for 3 months of backbreaking work, and headed south with vague notions of finding employment in Arizona or New Mexico. But the money had run out faster than expected, eaten up by necessities and one disastrous poker game in a mining town where he foolishly thought his luck might change. Now he stood in the middle of nowhere, with an injured horse, empty pockets, and nothing but red rock and sagebrush in every direction. The nearest town, according to the last prospector he had encountered, was Redemption Falls, still 2 days' ride to the southeast. 2 days if Copper had been sound. With her injured leg, it might take twice that long, and Jake wasn't sure either of them had that much time left. The water situation was critical. He had been rationing carefully, but even so, what remained in his canteen would barely last until tomorrow morning. And Copper needed water more than he did. He looked up at the canyon walls rising around him, their striated layers of red and orange rock telling the story of millions of years of geological history. His father had taught him to read the land, to look for signs of water and shelter, to understand the language of stone and sky. The old man had believed the earth would provide if a person knew how to ask properly, how to pay attention to what was being offered. Jake had always thought that was just romantic nonsense, the kind of thing men told themselves to feel less helpless against the vastness of the frontier. But standing here now, with desperation clawing at his chest, he found himself looking at the landscape with new eyes, searching for any hint of salvation. Copper suddenly lifted her head, her ears pricking forward with interest despite her obvious pain. She took a few halting steps, pulling against the reins in Jake's hand, heading not down the main trail but toward a narrow gap in the canyon wall that he had barely noticed. It was little more than a crack in the red stone, partially hidden by a cluster of juniper trees that somehow managed to survive in this harsh environment. Jake tried to pull her back, concerned that she was becoming delirious from pain and dehydration, but the mare was insistent, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Then he caught it too, just the faintest hint carried on the hot breeze, the smell of water. It was impossible, or at least highly improbable, but Copper's instincts were usually better than his own when it came to survival. He made a quick decision, gathering up the reins and following the mare as she limped determinedly toward the hidden gap. The opening was narrower than it appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for Copper to squeeze through, and Jake had to remove his bedroll and saddlebags to make the passage easier. The stone walls pressed close on either side, and for a moment he felt the irrational fear that they might become trapped, wedged between ancient rock with no way forward or back. But then the passage opened up, and Jake found himself staring at something he would have sworn was a mirage if Copper hadn't been seeing it too. Before them lay a hidden canyon invisible from the main trail, with steep walls that created a natural amphitheater, and running through the center of it, sparkling in the afternoon sun like a ribbon of silver, was a stream. Not a trickle or a muddy seep, but an actual flowing stream, clear and cold, fed by some underground spring that had been hidden here for who knows how long. The banks were lined with cottonwood trees and tall grass, creating a pocket of green in the middle of the red desert that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Jake stood frozen for a long moment, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Copper had no such hesitation. She pulled free from his slack grip and made her way down the gentle slope to the water's edge, where she plunged her muzzle into the stream and drank deeply. The sound of her satisfied gulping broke Jake's paralysis, and he stumbled forward on legs that suddenly felt weak with relief. He fell to his knees beside the stream, cupping the cold water in his hands and drinking until his stomach ached and his head began to clear from the fog of dehydration. It was only after he had satisfied his immediate thirst and refilled his canteen that Jake began to notice the other details of this hidden paradise. The stream was perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point, and he could see fish darting in the deeper pools. There was evidence of wildlife everywhere. Deer tracks in the soft mud along the banks, the distinctive prints of mountain lions near a fallen log, and the scattered feathers from birds that had come here to drink and bathe. This place was a lifeline for every creature in these canyons, a secret kept by the stone walls and the clever camouflage of the narrow entrance. But as his eyes adjusted to the dappled shade beneath the cottonwood trees, Jake noticed something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. On the far bank of the stream, partially hidden by the tall grass, were the unmistakable remains of a camp. Not a recent camp with ashes still warm and supplies scattered about, but an old one, abandoned long enough that weather had begun to reclaim it. He could make out the collapsed remains of a lean-to shelter, its support poles still standing like the ribs of some long-dead beast. And there, glinting in a shaft of sunlight that penetrated the canopy, was something that definitely didn't belong in a prospector's camp or a trapper's temporary home. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his belt as he studied the glinting object across the stream. The afternoon sun was playing tricks with shadows and light, making it difficult to identify what he was seeing, but his instincts, honed by years of frontier living, told him that whatever lay in that abandoned camp was worth investigating. He glanced at Copper, who was still drinking contentedly from the stream, her injured leg temporarily forgotten in the relief of finding water. The mare seemed unconcerned about any danger, which was somewhat reassuring as horses could sense threats that humans often missed. He waded across the stream, the cold water soaking through his worn boots and bringing blessed relief to his blistered feet. The current was gentle but constant, and he could feel the smooth river stones shifting slightly beneath his weight. The water came up to his knees at the deepest point, and small fish scattered away from his legs in silvery flashes. When he reached the far bank, he paused again, listening intently for any sound that might indicate he wasn't alone in this hidden canyon. But there was nothing except the gurgle of the stream, the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the breeze, and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere high above the canyon walls. The abandoned camp looked even more desolate up close. The lean-to had probably been sturdy once, built by someone who knew what they were doing and intended to stay for a while. But time and weather had taken their toll, and now it sagged like a tired old man, its canvas covering rotted away to mere shreds that flapped weakly in the wind. Jake could see where a fire pit had been dug, its stones still blackened from countless meals cooked over flames that had long since gone cold. There were fragments of pottery scattered nearby, the kind of simple tin plates and cups that any prospector or wanderer might carry, but it was the glinting object that had caught his attention from across the stream that drew him forward now. As he approached, pushing aside the tall grass that had grown up around the camp, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. Lying half buried in the dirt, as if someone had dropped it in haste or hidden it poorly before abandoning the site, was a leather saddlebag, and from the partially opened flap, he could see the unmistakable gleam of gold coins spilling out onto the ground. Jake's first instinct was to look around again, more carefully this time, searching for any sign of a trap or ambush. This was too convenient, too perfect. Nobody just left gold lying around in the middle of nowhere, not unless they were dead or running from something worse than losing their fortune. He crouched down beside the saddlebag, not touching it yet, examining the scene with the careful attention his father had taught him to use when something seemed too good to be true. The leather of the bag was old and weathered, but not as deteriorated as it should have been if it had been sitting here exposed to the elements for years. Someone had either placed this here recently or it had been protected somehow until just lately. Looking more closely at the ground around the lean-to, Jake began to notice other details that told a story. There were old stains in the dirt that might have been blood, though it was impossible to be certain after so much time had passed. Some of the support poles for the shelter showed marks that could have been made by bullets, splintered wood and gouges that suggested violence rather than simple decay. And there, partially hidden under what remained of the canvas, was something that made Jake's stomach tighten with unease. A human skeleton, or at least part of one, the bones picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the sun. He backed away from the saddlebag without touching it, his mind racing through possibilities. This had been someone's hiding place, clearly. Someone who had come to this hidden canyon with gold, perhaps stolen gold if the violence suggested by the scene was any indication, and had died here without being able to retrieve their prize. But why hadn't anyone else found it? Surely if there had been a robbery or a crime involving this much gold, there would have been searchers, pauses, someone looking for the missing money. Unless nobody knew where to look. Unless this man had hidden himself so well that even his pursuers couldn't find him. Jake sat down heavily on a fallen log, his earlier relief at finding water now complicated by this unexpected discovery. The gold in that saddlebag represented more money than he had seen in his entire life. Even from a distance, he could tell there were at least 100 coins visible, probably more hidden deeper in the bag. At $20 per coin, that was $2,000 just in what he could see. Maybe twice that much if the bag was full. It was enough money to buy a small ranch, to start over, to build the kind of life his father had always dreamed about, but never achieved. But it was also trouble. Jake knew enough about the frontier to understand that large amounts of gold didn't appear without strings attached. Someone had owned this money once. Someone might still be looking for it. And taking it would make him either a thief or a target, possibly both. He thought about the bones lying under that collapsed shelter. wondered what story they could tell if they could speak. Had this man stolen the gold himself, only to die alone in his hiding place? Or had he been robbed by someone else, murdered for his fortune and left here to rot while his killer escaped with the larger share? The sensible thing to do would be to leave the gold where it lay, to fill his canteen and water copper, and continue on to Redemption Falls without mentioning what he had found. Let someone else deal with the complications and the questions and the potential danger. Jake had enough problems without adding mysterious dead bodies and stolen gold to the list. But even as he thought this, he knew he was only fooling himself. He was broke, desperate, and staring at enough money to change his entire life. Walking away from that kind of opportunity required a strength of character he wasn't sure he possessed. He stood up and walked back to the saddlebag, kneeling down beside it with his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached out to touch the worn leather, half expecting something terrible to happen the moment he made contact. But nothing did. The bag was just a bag, and the gold was just gold, cold and heavy and real beneath his fingers. He pulled it open fully, and his breath caught again as he saw that his initial estimate had been too conservative. The bag was stuffed with gold coins, easily $3,000 or $4,000 worth, along with several small leather pouches that clinked with the sound of more coins inside. Beneath the gold, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a letter. Jake pulled it out carefully, noting that the paper was yellowed with age but still intact, thanks to its protective wrapping. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone injured or in great distress, and several dark stains that might have been blood marked the edges of the paper. He unfolded it slowly, squinting at the faded ink in the dappled sunlight. The letter was dated April 15th, 1881, more than 3 years ago. It read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Samuel Bridger and I am dying. The gold in this bag belongs rightfully to the Copper Ridge Mining Company, stolen by my partner Jack Whelan in a robbery that left 2 guards dead. I helped him escape, God forgive me, but when he realized I was wounded and slowing him down, he shot me and left me here to die. He took the rest of the money, nearly $8,000, and headed south toward Mexico. This is all that remains, hidden here because I was too weak to carry it further. If you are an honest man, return this money to the Copper Ridge Company in Denver. If you are not, may you have better luck with it than I did." Jake read the letter 3 times, trying to process what it meant. The man whose bones lay under that collapsed shelter had been a thief and a murderer's accomplice, but he had also tried to make amends in his final moments. The gold was stolen property, which meant taking it would definitely make Jake a thief. But the company it had been stolen from was in Denver, hundreds of miles away, and the robbery had happened 3 years ago. Chances were good that the mining company had written off the loss and moved on. Chances were equally good that nobody was looking for this money anymore. Copper whinnied from across the stream, reminding Jake that she was still injured, and they were still in the middle of nowhere with limited supplies. He looked down at the gold in his hands, at the letter with its faded plea from a dying man, and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like the afternoon heat. $3,000 could buy him everything he had ever wanted. It could also buy him a world of trouble if the wrong people found out he had it. Jake sat beside the stream for the better part of an hour, the saddlebag of gold resting heavily in his lap, while his mind worked through the impossible mathematics of survival versus morality. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western rim of the canyon, painting the red rock walls in deeper shades of crimson and orange. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and he would need to make camp somewhere for the night. The question was whether that camp would be here in this hidden canyon with $3,000 in stolen gold, or somewhere else along the trail with nothing but his empty pockets and his conscience intact. He thought about his father, about the kind of man Tom Harrison had been. Honest to a fault, his mother used to say, sometimes with affection and sometimes with exasperation when that honesty had cost them opportunities or advantages. Tom had never stolen so much as a spare horseshoe in his entire life, had taught Jake that a man's word and his integrity were the only things that truly belonged to him in this world. Everything else could be taken away by bad luck or bad weather or bad people, but what you were inside, that was yours to keep or throw away as you chose. But his father had also died poor, had worked himself to exhaustion for other men's profit, and had left Jake with nothing except a lame horse and the dubious inheritance of his own stubborn principles. What good had honesty done Tom Harrison in the end? He was buried in a pauper's grave outside a town whose name Jake could barely remember, marked by a simple wooden cross that had probably rotted away to nothing by now. Meanwhile, men like Jack Whelan, the partner who had shot Samuel Bridger and escaped with $8,000, were probably living comfortable lives somewhere, their crimes forgotten or unpunished. Jake picked up the letter again, studying the shaky handwriting and the bloodstains that marked it like accusations. Samuel Bridger had tried to make amends, had attempted some form of restitution in his final moments, but he had still been a thief and an accomplice to murder. His deathbed confession didn't erase the 2 guards who had died in that robbery, didn't bring them back to their families, and yet there was something almost noble in the attempt, in the desire to make things right even when it was far too late to matter. The more Jake thought about it, the more complicated the situation became. If he took the gold to Denver and returned it to the Copper Ridge Mining Company, he would be doing the honest thing, the thing his father would have approved of. But it would cost him weeks of travel, money he didn't have for supplies and lodging, and at the end of it, he would receive what? A thank you? Maybe a small reward if the company was feeling generous, but probably nothing more than a handshake and a pat on the back for his trouble. And he would still be poor, still be desperate, still be struggling to survive in a world that didn't much care whether he lived or died. On the other hand, if he kept the gold, he could change his entire life. He could buy land, good land, not some hardscrabble patch of desert, but real grazing territory with water and grass. He could build a house, not a shack, but an actual home with proper walls and a sound roof. He could buy breeding stock, hire hands, become the kind of man his father had always dreamed of being. And maybe, just maybe, he could do some good with that money, could use it to help other people the way nobody had ever helped him. Copper had finished drinking and was now grazing on the lush grass that grew along the stream bank, her injured leg still bothering her, but not enough to stop her from eating. Jake watched her for a moment, remembering how his father had broken that mare himself, had spent weeks earning her trust before ever putting a saddle on her back. Tom Harrison had believed that you could tell everything about a man by how he treated his animals, by whether he was patient or cruel, gentle or harsh. What would his father say about a man who stole money, even money that had been stolen before? Would the layers of theft somehow cancel each other out? Or would they just compound into something darker and more corrupting? The answer came to him slowly, not as a revelation, but as a gradual understanding of what he had to do. He couldn't take all the gold. His conscience wouldn't let him, no matter how desperate his circumstances. But he also couldn't just walk away from it and continue starving on the trail. There had to be a middle ground, a compromise between his needs and his principles. He would take enough to survive, enough to get himself and Copper to somewhere safe, and he would leave the rest. And when he was back on his feet, when he had work and money coming in honestly, he would find a way to make restitution for what he had borrowed. Jake opened the saddlebag again and began counting out coins. He took $200 in gold, enough to buy supplies and pay for lodging and veterinary care for Copper's injured leg, enough to give him a chance to start over somewhere new. But he left the rest, nearly $3,000, carefully rewrapping the letter and placing it on top of the remaining gold. He closed the saddlebag and carried it over to the lean-to, placing it in a more protected spot where it might survive another few years of weather. Then he found some large flat stones and stacked them over the bag, creating a cairn that would mark its location without being obvious from a distance. As he worked, he found himself talking to the bones of Samuel Bridger, explaining what he was doing and why. It felt foolish carrying on a conversation with a dead man, but somehow it helped him think through his reasoning. He promised the skeleton that he would return the money someday, would make things right when he was able. He promised that he wouldn't forget about this place or about the debt he was incurring, and he promised that he would try to be a better man than circumstances were pushing him to be, would try to honor his father's memory, even while bending the rules enough to survive. When the cairn was finished, Jake stood back and examined his work. It looked natural enough, like a random pile of stones that might have fallen from the canyon walls over time. Anyone who stumbled across it would have to look very carefully to realize it was marking something deliberately hidden. He wondered if anyone would ever find it, or if the gold would sit here for another 3 years, or 30, or 300, waiting for someone else to face the same moral dilemma he had wrestled with this afternoon. The sun was getting lower now, and Jake needed to make some practical decisions about camp. The hidden canyon offered everything he needed for a comfortable night: water and grass for Copper, shelter under the cottonwood trees, and plenty of deadwood for a fire. But something about staying here, sleeping next to a dead man's bones and stolen gold, made him uneasy. It felt too much like temptation, like if he stayed, he might wake up in the morning and decide to take more of the money, might rationalize away his earlier resolution until the entire saddlebag was empty and he was no better than Jack Whelan. He decided to make camp about a quarter-mile back up the narrow passage they had used to enter the canyon, close enough to access the stream, but far enough away to feel like he had put some distance between himself and the temptation. He gathered his gear from where he had left it near the entrance, coaxed Copper back through the narrow gap with promises of more grass on the other side, and found a suitable spot where an overhang in the rock would provide shelter if the weather turned bad during the night. As he worked to set up his simple camp, laying out his bedroll and gathering wood for a fire, Jake kept thinking about the $200 in gold coins now hidden in his saddlebag. It felt heavier than it should, as if the weight of his compromise was adding physical mass to the metal. He had told himself it was borrowing, not stealing, but he knew the distinction was mostly semantic. If he never managed to return the money, if circumstances prevented him from making restitution, then his intentions wouldn't matter. He would still be a thief, just one with a more elaborate justification than most. But for tonight, he had water and a little bit of hope, and that was more than he had possessed this morning. Copper's leg would need attention soon, but the rest and grazing would help with her recovery. And the money in his pocket would allow him to reach Redemption Falls and beyond, would give him options instead of just desperate circumstances. He built his fire as the last light faded from the sky, watching the flames catch and grow, sending sparks spiraling up toward the first stars appearing overhead. The canyon walls around him glowed red in the firelight, ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to his moral struggles. This land had seen countless people come and go, had witnessed crimes and kindnesses, betrayals and acts of courage. The gold hidden under those stones was just another small drama in an endless succession of human stories, important to him, but meaningless to the vast indifference of stone and sky and time. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of Copper moving restlessly near the makeshift picket line he had set up the night before. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air held that peculiar chill that came just before sunrise in the high desert, when the temperature dropped enough to make a man grateful for his blanket, despite the scorching heat that would return with the morning sun. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the canyon waking around him. The twitter of birds in the cottonwood trees, the distant howl of a coyote greeting the approaching day, and underneath it all, the constant murmur of the hidden stream that had saved their lives. He rose stiffly, his body protesting after days of hard riding and sleeping on the ground. The $200 in gold coins clinked softly in his saddlebag as he moved, a constant reminder of the compromise he had made and the debt he had taken on. In the growing light, he checked Copper's injured leg, finding the swelling had gone down somewhat after a night of rest and access to good grazing. She would still need proper veterinary attention, but she could travel now, and that was what mattered. They needed to put distance between themselves and this place before he changed his mind about the gold he had left behind. Jake filled his canteen from the stream one last time, then stood at the entrance to the hidden canyon for a long moment, committing it to memory. He needed to be able to find this place again when the time came to return what he had taken. The narrow gap in the rock wall, the cluster of juniper trees that partially concealed it, the particular angle of the canyon walls that made it invisible from the main trail. He fixed these details in his mind like a map, knowing that memory could be unreliable, but hoping his sense of obligation would keep the location sharp and clear. The ride to Redemption Falls took 3 days instead of the 2 the prospector had estimated, partly because of Copper's lingering lameness and partly because Jake found himself being more cautious than usual, watching the trail ahead and behind for any signs of trouble. The gold in his saddlebag made him nervous in a way that poverty never had. When you had nothing, nobody bothered you because there was nothing to take. But now he was carrying more money than most men in this territory would see in a year, and if word somehow got out, he would become a target for every desperado and thief within 100 miles. The country changed as he traveled southeast, the red rock canyons gradually giving way to more varied terrain, with rolling hills covered in piñon pine and juniper. He saw more signs of civilization as well. Fence lines marking claimed territory, cattle grazing in fenced pastures, and eventually a rough wagon road that showed evidence of regular traffic. Other travelers passed him occasionally, mostly prospectors and freight haulers, and Jake exchanged brief greetings with them while being careful not to invite conversation or questions about where he had come from or where he was going. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he crested a hill and saw Redemption Falls spread out in the valley below. It was larger than he had expected, not just a cluster of ramshackle buildings thrown together by optimistic miners, but an actual town with proper streets, a church steeple rising above the other structures and what looked like several substantial brick buildings near the center. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and he could see people moving along the streets, wagons and horses tied up outside businesses, the bustle of commerce and community that marked a settlement taking root and planning to stay. Jake felt something loosen in his chest at the sight. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt like he was approaching safety rather than just more uncertainty. A town this size would have a doctor or veterinarian who could properly treat Copper's leg. It would have a general store where he could buy real supplies, not just the bare necessities, but actual food and decent clothes to replace the rags he was wearing. And it might have work. Opportunities for a man who knew horses and cattle and wasn't afraid of hard labor. He rode down into town as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, noting the curious glances from people who watched him pass. He knew what they were seeing, a dusty cowboy on a lame horse, his clothes worn nearly to transparency in places, his face burned dark by the sun and marked with the lean hunger of someone who had been living on the edge for too long. He looked like exactly what he was, someone down on his luck and desperate for a change in fortune. The irony of having $200 in gold hidden in his saddlebag while looking like a penniless drifter was not lost on him. The first priority was Copper. Jake followed the main street until he spotted a building with a sign that read Miller's Livery and Veterinary Services. A barrel-chested man with iron-gray hair was working in the yard out front, shoeing a black gelding with practiced efficiency. He looked up as Jake approached, his experienced eye immediately assessing both horse and rider. The man set down his tools and walked over, running his hand down Copper's injured leg with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Stone bruise," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a hint of German accent. "A bad one, too." "She has been traveling on this?" Jake nodded, feeling defensive despite knowing the criticism was fair. "I didn't have much choice. We were stuck in the canyons with no water and no way forward except to keep moving." The veterinarian grunted, neither approving nor condemning, just acknowledging the reality of frontier life where sometimes you had to choose between two bad options and hope for the best. "I can treat her. Keep her here for a week to rest and heal properly. Cost you $15 for the treatment and boarding, feed included." Jake felt relief wash over him, both because Copper would get proper care and because $15 was well within his means now. He nodded agreement and dismounted, wincing slightly as his own stiffness made itself known. The veterinarian noticed. "You are injured also?" "Just sore from too many days in the saddle," Jake replied, but the older man was already looking at him with the same assessing gaze he had given Copper. "You have lost weight recently. Your face is showing dehydration damage even though you have clearly had water recently, and you move like a man who has been running on empty for too long. My wife runs a boarding house 2 streets over, clean rooms and good food. Tell her Heinrich sent you and she will give you a fair rate." The kindness in the offer caught Jake off guard. He had become so accustomed to suspicion and indifference that simple human decency felt almost foreign. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I appreciate that." The veterinarian waved off his thanks. "We all need help sometimes. The trick is accepting it when it is offered instead of being too proud to admit we need it." Jake left Copper in Heinrich's capable hands, taking only his saddlebags and bedroll with him as he walked deeper into town. The gold coins clinked softly with each step, a secret weight that seemed to grow heavier rather than lighter as he carried it. He found the boarding house easily enough, a 2-story building with fresh paint and lace curtains in the windows. A plump woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron answered his knock, and when he mentioned Heinrich had sent him, her face brightened with welcome. Within an hour, Jake found himself sitting at a proper table, eating his first real meal in weeks, pot roast with potatoes and carrots and fresh-baked bread that tasted like something from a dream he had forgotten he was having. There were 4 other boarders at the table, a mining engineer, a school teacher, a widow who ran a dress shop, and a young man who worked as a clerk at the assay office. They were polite without being intrusive, asking general questions about where he had come from, but not pressing when his answers remained vague. After dinner, Jake paid for a week's lodging in advance, watching Mrs. Muller's eyes widen slightly when he produced a $20 gold piece from his pocket. She made change carefully, giving him back 5 silver dollars, and he saw her exchange a glance with her husband, who had joined them from his workshop out back. Jake realized his mistake immediately. A man who looked as desperate as he did shouldn't be carrying gold coins, shouldn't be able to pay for a week in advance without hesitation. It raised questions, created suspicions that would have been better avoided, but it was too late to take it back now. He accepted his change with a nod of thanks and retreated to his room, a small but clean space on the 2nd floor with a real bed and a window that looked out over the main street. He locked the door behind him, then sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the remaining gold, counting it carefully. $180 left after paying for Copper's treatment and his lodging. Still more money than he had ever possessed at one time, but suddenly it seemed less like freedom and more like a complicated problem he hadn't fully thought through. Sleep came hard that night despite the comfort of a real bed for the first time in months. Jake lay awake listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the evening, the distant piano music from what he assumed was a saloon, voices calling goodnight to each other on the street below, the bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. These were the sounds of civilization, of people living in community with each other, and they should have been comforting. Instead, they made him feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that the empty prairie never had. He kept thinking about the look Mrs. Muller had given her husband when he produced that gold coin. It was the look of people who had learned to be cautious, who had seen enough of frontier life to know that a man's appearance and his means didn't always match up in ways that made sense. In the morning, there would be questions, or if not direct questions, then conversations and speculations. Word would spread in a town this size. People would wonder about the stranger with the lame horse and worn clothes who paid for a week's lodging in gold. By the time dawn light began filtering through his window, Jake had made a decision. He needed a story, a plausible explanation for why he had money that wouldn't invite too much scrutiny or too many follow-up questions. The truth was obviously out of the question, but a careful lie, one close enough to reality to be believable, might serve. He had worked ranches his entire adult life. It wouldn't be unreasonable to claim he had saved his wages over several seasons, that he was looking to buy land and start his own small operation. Men did that all the time, scraped together enough to make a start of it. He dressed in his cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Muller already up and preparing breakfast for her boarders. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the kitchen, and despite his troubled night, Jake felt his stomach respond with interest. The widow who ran the dress shop was already at the table along with the mining engineer, both of them looking as if they had slept much better than he had. Mrs. Muller served him coffee without comment, but Jake could feel her curiosity like a physical presence in the room. He decided to address it directly rather than let speculation fester. "I apologize if I startled you last evening," he said, keeping his tone casual and friendly. "Paying with that gold piece when I looked like I've been sleeping rough for a month. I know how it must have appeared." The older woman paused in her serving, her expression softening slightly. "It is not my place to judge, Mr. Harrison. A man's business is his own." But Jake pressed on, committed now to establishing his story. "I've been working ranches up in Colorado for the past 5 years, saving everything I could. Had my eye on buying some land, maybe starting a small horse breeding operation. Then my father died last spring, and I had to use most of what I'd saved for his burial and settling his debts. I've been traveling since then, looking for the right opportunity, the right place to start over." It was mostly true, or at least the emotional core of it was true, even if the specific details about the source of his money were fabricated. Jake had learned that the best lies were the ones that contained as much truth as possible, that drew on real feelings and real experiences even when the facts were invented. Mrs. Muller nodded slowly, her suspicion not entirely gone but noticeably reduced. "That is a hard thing, to lose a parent and your dreams in the same season. But you are young yet and strong. You will find your opportunity." The mining engineer, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, spoke up for the first time. "If you're looking for land and work with horses, you should talk to Margaret Chambers. She owns the Broken Creek Ranch about 10 miles outside of town. Her husband died 2 years ago, and she's been trying to keep the operation running with just a few hands, but she's struggling. Word is, she might need to sell if she can't find reliable help." Jake felt a flicker of genuine interest. "What kind of operation?" "Mostly horses, some cattle. Her late husband was known for breeding good working stock, quarter horses with solid temperaments. The ranch has good water rights and decent grazing, but it's more than one woman can manage alone, even with her daughter helping." The widow at the table added her own observation. "Margaret is proud, though. She won't accept charity or pity. If you approach her about work, you'd better be prepared to prove yourself. She's turned away more than one man who thought she'd be easy to take advantage of because she's a woman alone." Jake finished his breakfast while listening to more details about the Chambers Ranch and its owner. By the time he left the boarding house, he had a destination and a purpose, something beyond just surviving day to day. The idea of honest work, of earning his keep legitimately while copper healed, appealed to him more than he wanted to admit. Maybe if he could establish himself here, prove his worth through labor rather than stolen gold, he could begin to work off the debt he felt he owed for taking that $200. He spent the morning walking through Redemption Falls, getting a sense of the town and its rhythms. There was a general store that seemed well stocked, a bank that looked prosperous and solid, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, a newspaper office, and various other businesses that suggested a community with staying power. This wasn't some fly-by-night mining camp that would disappear as soon as the ore ran out. People were putting down roots here, building something meant to last. At the general store, Jake bought new clothes with some of his remaining gold, practical work shirts and denim trousers that would stand up to ranch labor, along with a new pair of boots that actually fit properly and didn't have holes in the soles. The storekeeper, a jovial man named Peterson, was happy to talk about the area while he wrapped up the purchases. "You picked a good time to arrive," he said. "We're growing faster than most towns in the territory. The railroad's talking about extending a spur line through here, which would mean even more opportunity for folks willing to work hard." Jake asked about the Chambers Ranch, keeping his questions casual and general. Peterson confirmed what he had already heard at breakfast. Margaret Chambers was respected but struggling, trying to maintain her late husband's legacy while dealing with the practical difficulties of running a ranch without a man's help. She had a daughter, Emily, who was nearly 18 and as capable as many men when it came to ranch work, but that still wasn't enough to handle everything that needed doing. That afternoon, Jake visited Copper at the livery and found her looking better already after proper treatment and rest. Heinrich was pleased with her progress and confident she would make a full recovery with continued care. The veterinarian also mentioned, with seeming casualness, that he had heard Jake was asking about the Chambers Ranch. "If you do go out there," he said, "be respectful and honest with Margaret. She has had too many men try to cheat her or pressure her into selling for less than the land is worth. She trusts very few people these days." The warning was clear, and Jake appreciated it. He was beginning to understand that Redemption Falls, despite its rough frontier setting, was a community that looked after its own and had little patience for those who would take advantage of widows or anyone else in a vulnerable position. It made him feel both more secure in his decision to settle here temporarily and more anxious about the secret he was carrying. If these people found out he had taken stolen gold, even with his rationalizations about borrowing and intending to repay, they would not be understanding. That evening at dinner, Jake announced his intention to ride out to the Chambers Ranch the next day and ask about work. Mrs. Muller approved of this plan, as did the other boarders, though the schoolteacher warned him that Margaret Chambers had a sharp tongue and didn't suffer fools gladly. "She'll test you," the teacher said with a knowing smile. "She'll want to see if you can actually do the work you claim to know, and she'll be watching to see if you treat her daughter with proper respect, or if you're one of those men who thinks a woman alone is desperate enough to accept any kind of behavior." Jake assured them he had no intentions beyond honest work for honest pay, and he meant it. The gold hidden in his room upstairs was already weighing on his conscience more than he had anticipated. The sooner he could establish a legitimate source of income and begin working toward returning what he had taken, the better he would feel. That night, he slept somewhat better, his mind beginning to settle on a path forward that didn't feel quite as morally compromised as the past few days had been. Before dawn the next morning, Jake was up and preparing for the ride to Broken Creek Ranch. He left most of his gold hidden in his room, taking only a small amount in case of emergency, and set out on a rented horse since Copper was still recovering. The directions Peterson had given him were clear, and as the sun rose over the eastern hills, Jake found himself following a well-maintained road that wound through increasingly impressive grazing land. The Broken Creek Ranch appeared in the distance as Jake crested a low rise, and what he saw made him slow the rented horse to study the layout with appreciation. The main house was a solid log structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney, positioned on a slight elevation that would give views of the surrounding rangeland. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn that looked well-maintained despite some weathering, a bunkhouse, corrals that were sturdy and functional, and what appeared to be a small stable set apart from the main barn. The property had the look of a working ranch that had been successful once and could be again with proper management and enough hands to do the necessary work. As he rode closer, Jake noticed the signs of struggle that the townspeople had mentioned. Fences that needed mending in several places, a section of the barn roof that sagged slightly and would leak in heavy rain, corrals with missing rails that made them unusable for containing horses. These weren't signs of neglect exactly, but rather the evidence of too much work for too few people. Someone was keeping up with the essential maintenance but falling behind on everything else, and in ranch work, falling behind on small problems usually meant they became big problems eventually. A woman emerged from the barn as he approached, and Jake knew immediately this was Margaret Chambers. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so marked by exhaustion and worry. She carried a pitchfork with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use it for work or defense, and her eyes assessed him with the kind of sharp intelligence that missed nothing. She wore men's work pants and a simple shirt, practical clothing for ranch work that some women might have been self-conscious about, but she wore with complete unconcern for conventional propriety. Jake dismounted while still a respectful distance away, taking off his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Chambers, my name is Jake Harrison. I'm looking for ranch work, and folks in town suggested I might speak with you about possibilities here." Her expression didn't change, but he saw her grip shift slightly on the pitchfork, ready for trouble if this turned into something other than what he claimed. "We're not hiring," she said flatly. "I can't afford extra hands right now." "I'm not asking for top wages," Jake replied, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "I know horses and cattle, I can mend fences and fix roofs, and I'm willing to work for room and board, plus whatever you can afford to pay when you can afford it. I saw at least a dozen things that need doing just riding up your road, and I'd wager there are twice that many once a person gets a closer look." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what makes you think I need charity from a drifter who shows up claiming he'll work for next to nothing? If you're one of those men looking to take advantage of a woman alone, thinking I'm desperate enough to accept any kind of arrangement, you can turn that horse around right now." The accusation stung, partly because there was enough truth in it to make Jake uncomfortable, though not in the way she meant. He was desperate, and he was looking to take advantage of an opportunity, but not in the way she feared. "I'm not offering charity, and I'm not looking to take advantage," he said quietly. "I'm a man who needs work, and you're a woman who needs help. That's just good business, not charity on either side." Before Margaret could respond, a younger woman came around the corner of the barn leading a magnificent bay mare that was clearly in foal. The resemblance to Margaret was strong enough that Jake knew this had to be Emily, the daughter he had heard about. She was perhaps 17 or 18, with the same dark hair as her mother but worn in a long braid down her back, and the same sharp eyes that took in every detail of the stranger in their yard. She handed the mare's lead rope to her mother, without taking her gaze off Jake. "Mama," she said quietly, "that's the 4th man this month who's come looking for work. Maybe we should at least hear what he has to say." Margaret's jaw tightened, but Jake could see she was considering it. The fact that her daughter was willing to speak up suggested they had discussed their situation before, that Emily understood just how precarious their position was. Finally, Margaret nodded curtly and gestured toward the barn. "Come inside where we can talk properly. But understand this, Mr. Harrison. I've heard every lie and seen every trick that men use to try to manipulate women they think are vulnerable. If you're not genuine, I'll know it, and you'll regret wasting my time." Inside the barn, which was clean and organized despite the evident shortage of labor, Margaret gestured for Jake to sit on a hay bale while she and Emily remained standing. It was a deliberate power dynamic, letting him know that he was on their territory and they were in control. Jake respected the tactic and made no move to challenge it. "Tell me about your experience," Margaret said, her tone making it clear this was an interrogation, not a friendly conversation. Jake told her about his years working various ranches, his father's death, his recent travels, sticking to the cover story he had established at the boarding house. He emphasized his experience with horses, particularly breaking and training, which he could see sparked interest in both women's eyes. When he mentioned his mare Copper and her current recovery at Heinrich's livery, Margaret's expression softened fractionally. "Heinrich is a good man and an excellent veterinarian," she said. "If he's treating your horse, then at least you care enough about your animals to pay for proper care." The implied question was clear, and Jake understood he was being tested on multiple levels. "Yes, ma'am. Copper was my father's horse, and she's all I have left of him. I'd go hungry before I'd let her suffer for lack of care." Emily exchanged a look with her mother, and something passed between them, some silent communication that Jake couldn't quite interpret. Margaret set down the pitchfork she had been holding and crossed her arms, studying him with continued intensity. "My husband built this ranch over 20 years, she said finally. "When he died, people assumed I'd sell, that I couldn't possibly manage without a man. I've spent 2 years proving them wrong, but I'm not too proud to admit I'm reaching the limit of what Emily and I can do alone. We need help, but we need it from someone trustworthy, someone who'll respect that this is our land and our operation, not some charity case waiting for a man to take over." Jake met her eyes directly. "I'm not looking to take over anything, Mrs. Chambers. I'm looking for honest work that will let me rebuild my own stake so I can eventually buy land of my own. What you're describing sounds like a fair arrangement for both of us. You get experienced help, and I get a chance to earn while my horse heals and I figure out my next move. No tricks, no hidden agenda, just work for wages." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her sharp gaze searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Trial period," she said. 2 weeks. You'll sleep in the bunkhouse, take meals with us at the main house, and I'll pay you $20 for the 2 weeks plus room and board. If you work out, we'll discuss longer-term arrangements. If you don't, you leave without complaint and without expecting any additional compensation. Those are my terms. The wages were low, but fair given that he was unproven and she was taking a risk by hiring him at all. Jake stood and extended his hand. "That's more than fair, Mrs. Chambers. I accept your terms." She shook his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong, her calluses testimony to the hard work she had been doing. Emily stepped forward then, her expression less suspicious than her mother's, but no less serious. "The bunkhouse is clean but basic," she said. "There's a pump outside for washing, and meals are at sunrise, noon, and sunset. We don't tolerate drinking, gambling, or any disrespect toward either of us. Break any of those rules and you're gone immediately, trial period or not." "Understood," Jake replied, meeting her eyes with the same respect he had shown her mother. "I'm here to work, not cause problems." Margaret walked him to the bunkhouse, a small but solid structure with 4 bunks, though clearly only one had been used recently, probably by a hand who had moved on. As Jake unsaddled the rented horse and began settling his few possessions on one of the empty bunks, Margaret lingered in the doorway. "Why are you really here, Mr. Harrison?" she asked quietly. "A man with your experience could find work at any of the big operations around here, probably for better wages than I can offer. Why come to a struggling ranch run by a widow?" Jake paused in his unpacking, Margaret's question hanging in the air between them like a challenge he couldn't quite sidestep. He could give her another version of his carefully constructed story, add more layers to the lie he had already built. But something about her direct gaze and the hard-won wisdom in her eyes told him that anything less than genuine honesty at least as much as he could afford to give, would be a mistake. Because sometimes the hardest work isn't on the big operations, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. Sometimes it's more satisfying to help build something than to just maintain what's already successful. My father spent his whole life working for other men's dreams. I'd like to think I could help someone hold on to theirs. It was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. Margaret studied him for another long moment, then nodded slightly, as if he had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "We start early," she said. "Sunrise means sunrise, not an hour after when you feel like getting up." With that, she turned and walked back toward the main house, her shoulders carrying the weight of responsibility that had probably never felt heavier than it did right now, trusting a stranger to help with work that meant everything to her family's survival. Jake finished settling in, then returned the rented horse to town before darkness fell, walking the 10 miles back to the ranch through the cooling evening air. The exercise felt good after days of tension and moral uncertainty, and by the time he reached the bunkhouse again, he was tired enough that sleep came easily, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. He dreamed of his father, of conversations they had never quite finished, and of the hidden canyon with its stream and its buried gold and its warning about the cost of compromise. The next morning began before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon. Jake woke to the sound of Margaret and Emily already moving around outside, beginning their day with the kind of efficiency that came from too much work and too little time. He dressed quickly and found them in the barn, where Emily was milking their 2 cows, while Margaret mixed feed for the horses. Neither woman acknowledged his arrival beyond a brief nod, and Jake understood this was another test. They wanted to see if he would wait for instructions or if he knew enough about ranch work to make himself useful without being told. He grabbed a pitchfork and began mucking out the stalls that needed it, working methodically through the barn while the women finished their own tasks. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, and for the first time in days, Jake found his mind settling into the rhythm of work rather than spinning anxiously through the complications of his situation. By the time Emily called them to breakfast, he had cleaned 6 stalls and started repairs on a broken stall door, using tools he found carefully organized on a workbench that had probably belonged to Margaret's late husband. Breakfast was simple but substantial: eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter that Emily had churned herself. They ate at a worn wooden table in the ranch house kitchen, and Jake noticed the little details that spoke of a home maintained with care despite limited resources. Curtains that had been mended multiple times, but were still clean and hanging straight. Dishes that didn't match but were carefully washed and arranged. A small vase with wildflowers on the windowsill, a touch of beauty in the midst of endless practical concerns. Margaret laid out the day's work over the meal. The north fence line needed extensive repairs, several horses needed shoeing, and there was a section of the barn roof that would leak disastrously if they didn't get it patched before the next rain. It was more work than 3 people could reasonably accomplish in a single day, but Jake understood this too was a test. She wanted to see not just if he could work hard, but if he could prioritize sensibly and work smart rather than just throwing effort at everything without strategy. He suggested they tackle the roof first since weather was unpredictable and water damage would make everything else harder. Margaret agreed with a brief nod that might have been approval. They spent the morning on the barn, Jake working alongside Emily while Margaret handled other tasks. The daughter proved to be as capable as her mother had suggested, holding her end of board steady and climbing the ladder without hesitation or complaint. She was also more talkative than Margaret, asking questions about where Jake had worked before and what he knew about horse breeding. "My father wanted to build a reputation for quality quarter horses," Emily explained as they worked. "He believed that good temperament was just as important as physical ability, that a horse needed to be smart and willing, not just fast or strong. We still have his breeding stock, but we haven't had the time or resources to really develop the program the way he envisioned." There was a wistfulness in her voice that spoke of dreams deferred rather than abandoned, and Jake found himself genuinely interested in what she was describing. By midday, they had patched the roof and moved on to other tasks. Jake spent the afternoon working on the fence line while Margaret and Emily handled the horses. The work was hot and hard, digging new post holes and resetting rails that had rotted or come loose, but it was also the kind of tangible progress that felt satisfying. He could see the difference he was making, could watch the fence line become secure and functional again. This was honest labor, the kind his father had done all his life. And there was a cleanness to it that the stolen gold in his saddlebag back in town would never have. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Jake returned to the ranch yard to find a wagon pulled up near the house and a well-dressed man in conversation with Margaret. Even from a distance, Jake could see the tension in her posture, the way she stood with her arms crossed defensively. Emily stood nearby, her expression hostile, and Jake felt his instincts prickle with warning. This was not a friendly social call. He approached slowly, not wanting to intrude if this was personal business, but as he got closer, he could hear the man's voice, smooth and reasonable in a way that somehow made Jake's skin crawl. "I'm simply pointing out that you have options, Mrs. Chambers. The bank doesn't want to foreclose, but we do need to see payments being made on schedule. Selling to someone who can manage the property effectively would solve all your problems." Margaret's response was ice cold. "My problems, Mr. Dalton, would be solved if your bank hadn't suddenly decided that the payment schedule my husband agreed to was no longer acceptable. We've never missed a payment, but somehow our terms keep changing to make it harder and harder to keep up." That sounds less like legitimate banking and more like manipulation designed to force a sale. Dalton's smile didn't waver, but Jake saw something predatory flicker in his eyes. "The bank has to respond to changing economic conditions, Mrs. Chambers. It's nothing personal. However, I happen to know several parties interested in purchasing quality ranch land, and I'd be happy to facilitate introductions. You could walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere easier, somewhere that doesn't require quite so much physical labor." "This is our home," Emily interjected sharply. "My father built this ranch, and we're not abandoning it just because your bank wants to steal it from us." Dalton turned his attention to the young woman, his expression one of patronizing sympathy that made Jake's hands curl into fists. "Ms. Chambers, I understand you're emotional about this, but surely you can see that your mother is working herself to exhaustion, trying to maintain something that's simply not viable for two women alone. The responsible thing would be to accept reality and make the best deal you can while you still have options." Jake had heard enough. He walked forward into their circle, positioning himself slightly in front of Margaret and Emily in a gesture of protection that was probably presumptuous but felt necessary. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made Dalton's attention snap toward him. "I couldn't help but overhear. It sounds like Mrs. Chambers has made her position clear. Perhaps it would be best if you respected that and let her run her ranch without further pressure from the bank." Dalton's eyes narrowed as he took in Jake's work-worn appearance and dusty clothes. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Jake Harrison, the new ranch hand. And I'm telling you that Mrs. Chambers doesn't need your advice or your assistance in selling her property. She's managing just fine." The banker's expression shifted from condescending patience to barely concealed irritation as he looked Jake up and down with obvious disdain. "A ranch hand," he said, his tone making it clear what he thought of Jake's position. "Well, Mr. Harrison, perhaps you should concern yourself with your own employment situation rather than matters of business you couldn't possibly understand. Mrs. Chambers and I are discussing serious financial matters that require more sophistication than mucking out stalls provides." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. But years of working for men who thought they were better than him had taught him how to control it, how to channel it into something more useful than just losing his temper. Actually, Mr. Dalton, I understand quite well. You're a man working for a bank that's trying to take advantage of a widow by changing the terms she agreed to with her husband. That's not sophisticated business. That's just theft dressed up in legal language. Dalton's face flushed red, and for a moment Jake thought the banker might actually lose his composure completely. But then Margaret stepped forward, and there was steel in her voice when she spoke. Mr. Dalton, I believe we're finished here. You can tell your employers at the bank that I will make my payments according to the original schedule I agreed to with my husband. If they choose to pursue foreclosure based on their unilaterally changed terms, I will fight them in court and make sure everyone in this territory knows exactly what kind of business practices your bank employs. The banker's smile returned, but it was thin and cold now, all pretense of friendliness abandoned. You would need a lawyer for that, Mrs. Chambers, and good lawyers are expensive. I wonder where you would find the money for such representation when you can barely afford to keep your ranch running. He climbed back into his wagon with exaggerated dignity, gathering the reins with sharp, angry movements. You're making a mistake by being stubborn about this. The bank's patience isn't infinite, and neither are your options. As Dalton drove away, Jake watched Margaret's shoulders sag slightly, the brief show of strength giving way to the exhaustion that lurked beneath it constantly. Emily moved to her mother's side, taking her hand in a gesture of comfort and solidarity that spoke of how many times they had faced challenges together. "Thank you for speaking up, Jake," Margaret said quietly. "But you should know that might have just cost you any future employment opportunities in this territory. Banks have long memories and influence in a lot of places." Jake shrugged, surprised to find he meant it when he said, "Then I'll work where they don't have influence. Some things matter more than protecting future job prospects." The two women looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and suspicion, as if they wanted to trust him, but had learned the hard way that trust was often misplaced. The evening meal was quieter than breakfast had been, the confrontation with Dalton casting a shadow over what should have been satisfaction at a productive day's work. But as they ate, Margaret began to open up about the situation with the bank, and Jake found himself learning just how precarious their position really was. Her husband Robert had taken out a loan 5 years ago to expand the horse breeding program, with payment terms that were reasonable and manageable based on the ranch's income. For 3 years, they had made every payment on time, building equity and reputation simultaneously. Then Robert had died, and within 6 months the bank had started changing the terms, claiming that the original agreement had included clauses about the primary borrower's death, triggering reassessment of risk. Margaret had fought back, demanding to see the original documents, but somehow the paperwork the bank produced now included language she was certain hadn't been there when Robert signed it. "It's a scheme," Emily said bitterly. "They do it to widows all the time. Change the terms knowing most women don't have the education or resources to fight back. Then, when the women can't keep up with the new payments, the bank forecloses and sells the property to one of their friends for less than it's worth. Everyone profits except the family that built the place." Jake listened with growing anger, recognizing the pattern of exploitation that seemed universal on the frontier. The strong preyed on the weak, and the law often protected the predators rather than their victims, because the predators had money and influence while the victims only had desperation and righteous anger. "How much do you owe them?" he asked. And Margaret hesitated before answering, as if even speaking the number aloud gave it more power. $800 under the original terms, spread over the next 3 years. Under their new terms, they want $400 immediately, or they'll start foreclosure proceedings. Jake felt his stomach tighten. $400 was more than twice what he had left from the gold he had taken. Even if he gave Margaret everything he had, it wouldn't be enough to save the ranch, and giving it to her would raise questions he couldn't answer, would require explanations that would unravel his carefully constructed story and possibly expose him as a thief. But the alternative was watching these women lose everything while he stood by with money in his pocket that he had stolen from people who probably needed it just as much as Margaret Chambers needed it now. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had told himself he was only borrowing that gold, that he would pay it back someday when he was able. Now he was confronted with people who needed help immediately, and he had the means to provide it. But doing so would require revealing things he had worked hard to keep hidden, would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny he couldn't afford. That night in the bunkhouse, Jake lay awake wrestling with his conscience yet again. The $200 he had taken seemed to multiply in weight and significance with each passing day, becoming less like borrowed money and more like blood money that stained everything he touched. He had come to this ranch looking for honest work to balance out his theft, to earn his way back to integrity through labor. But honest work wouldn't save the Broken Creek Ranch from foreclosure, wouldn't protect Margaret and Emily from losing their home and their livelihood. He thought about Samuel Bridger's letter, about the dying man's plea for whoever found the gold to return it to the Copper Ridge Mining Company. If Jake gave his remaining gold to Margaret, he would be even further from being able to make that restitution, would be compounding one theft with another use of stolen money. But if he didn't help, if he let these women lose their ranch while he hoarded money that wasn't rightfully his anyway, what did that make him? The mining company was a faceless corporation that had probably already written off the loss. Margaret and Emily were real people right in front of him, fighting for survival against forces stacked overwhelmingly against them. The next morning at breakfast, Jake made a decision that surprised him as much as it would surprise the women. "Mrs. Chambers, Emily, I have something I need to tell you," he began, and saw wariness immediately enter both their expressions. They had learned not to trust unexpected revelations from men. "I have some money saved, about $180. It's not enough to solve your problem with the bank, but it might buy you some time, might let you make a payment that shows good faith while you figure out other options." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's a considerable sum for a drifter to have saved, Mr. Harrison. Where exactly did this money come from?" Jake had prepared for this question, had worked out a story that was as close to the truth as he could make it without revealing everything. "My father left it to me," he said, which was technically true if you counted everything his father had left him, including the burden of choosing between competing moral obligations. "It was supposed to be for buying land, but I'd rather use it to help you keep yours than let it sit idle, while good people lose their home." Emily's eyes widened at Jake's offer, but Margaret's expression remained guarded, suspicious even in the face of what appeared to be genuine generosity. "Why would you do that?" she asked slowly. "You barely know us, and that money represents your entire future. Giving it away to help strangers doesn't make sense unless there's something else you want in return." The accusation stung, but Jake understood it. Margaret had been dealing with men who wanted things from her ever since her husband died, men who offered help with strings attached, who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a reason for compassion. "There's nothing else I want," Jake said quietly, "except maybe to feel like I've done something decent in a world that doesn't always reward decency. My father spent his whole life working hard and being honest, and he died with nothing to show for it. Maybe I can't change the way the world works, but I can choose not to be part of the problem." It was as honest as he could be without telling them the complete truth about where the money had really come from. And in a strange way, using the stolen gold to help these women felt like it might redeem the theft somewhat, might transform something taken in desperation into something given in compassion. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and Jake saw the moment when her suspicion began to crack, when she allowed herself to consider that his offer might actually be genuine. But even as her expression softened, she shook her head firmly. "I can't accept it, Mr. Harrison. It's too much, and I won't be responsible for taking away your chance at starting your own operation. We'll find another way to deal with the bank." Emily started to protest, but her mother held up a hand to forestall argument. "We'll find another way," she repeated, and there was steel in her voice that suggested the matter was closed. Jake felt frustration building in his chest. The money was already tainted by how he had acquired it, and giving it to Margaret would at least accomplish something good, rather than just sitting in his saddlebag as a constant reminder of his moral compromise. But he could see that pushing too hard would only make her more resistant, would trigger her pride and her suspicion in ways that would make her reject help she desperately needed. He decided to change tactics, to make it about something other than charity. "Then let me buy into the ranch," he said. "A partnership. My money and labor in exchange for a share of the operation and the breeding program. That way it's a business arrangement, not charity." Margaret's eyebrows rose, and he saw calculation replace some of the wariness in her expression. She was a practical woman, and a business proposition was something she could evaluate without feeling like she was accepting pity. "What kind of share?" she asked cautiously. 20%, Jake said, pulling a number that seemed reasonable out of the air. "I provide the immediate cash you need for the bank, plus continued labor as we build up the horse breeding program. In return, I get 1/5 of the profits in equity in the ranch. If we're successful, we all benefit. If we fail, at least we fail together as partners, rather than you failing alone." Emily was watching the exchange with bright, hopeful eyes, clearly wanting her mother to accept, but knowing better than to interfere in a business negotiation. Margaret was quiet for a long time, her sharp mind working through the implications and potential pitfalls of Jake's proposal. Finally, she nodded slowly. "We'd need a proper contract," she said. "Something legally binding that protects both our interests. And you'd need to understand that I make the final decisions about how the ranch operates. This would be a junior partnership, not an equal one." "Understood," Jake agreed, relief flooding through him. "I'm not trying to take over or push you out. I just want to help build something worth having." They shook hands across the kitchen table, and Jake felt the weight of yet another commitment settling onto his shoulders alongside all the others he had already accumulated. He was now tied to this ranch and these women by more than just wages for labor. He had become a partner in their struggle, which meant their success or failure would be his as well. The next week passed in a blur of hard work and careful planning. Jake contributed his $180 to make a payment to the bank, buying them precious time to organize their finances and develop a strategy for dealing with Dalton's continued pressure. Margaret proved to be a shrewd business mind when given the resources to work with, and together they began mapping out a plan for expanding the horse breeding program in ways that would generate income faster than the traditional slow build her husband had envisioned. Emily threw herself into the work with enthusiasm that made Jake think of what he might have been like at her age if circumstances had been different. If his father had managed to hold onto a piece of land long enough to build something lasting. She had her father's eye for horses and her mother's head for business, a combination that would serve her well if they could just hold onto the ranch long enough for her to come into her own. But success brought new complications that Jake hadn't fully anticipated. As word spread through Redemption Falls that the Chambers Ranch had made a substantial payment to the bank and hired a new partner, people began talking. Some of the talk was positive, neighbors expressing relief that Margaret might actually survive her husband's death and keep the ranch running. But some of it was suspicious, questions about where this mysterious new ranch hand had gotten the money to buy into a struggling operation, speculation about whether the arrangement was purely business or something more personal. Jake heard the gossip secondhand through Heinrich when he visited Copper at the livery. The veterinarian mentioned it casually while examining the mare's now-healed leg, but there was a question in his eyes that Jake couldn't quite answer honestly. "People were wondering," Heinrich said carefully. Because sometimes when things seem too fortunate, there are reasons for that fortune that aren't immediately visible. Jake understood what the older man was really asking, and he appreciated the directness even as he struggled to formulate a response that was truthful without being incriminating. "My father left me some money," he repeated the story he had told before, "and I decided to invest it rather than just spend it on myself." Sometimes the right opportunity comes along at the right time, and you either take advantage of it or you spend your whole life regretting that you didn't. It was vague enough to avoid outright lies while specific enough to sound plausible, but Jake could see that Heinrich wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. The veterinarian nodded slowly, accepting the answer without necessarily believing it completely, and Jake understood that he was being given the benefit of the doubt rather than unquestioning trust. But it was Margaret who brought up the most dangerous question a few days later as they worked together repairing fence line on the eastern boundary of the ranch. She had been quiet all morning, clearly working through something in her mind, and when she finally spoke, her words hit Jake like a physical blow. "I've been thinking about your story," she said without preamble, "about your father's death and the money he left you, and I realized something doesn't quite add up." Jake's hands stilled on the fence post he was setting, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" "If your father worked ranches his whole life, like you said, never managing to save much or buy his own land, where did he get the money to leave you $180? That's more than most ranch hands make in a year, and you said you had to use your savings for his burial. So where did the inheritance come from?" It was the question Jake had been dreading, the logical inconsistency in his carefully constructed story that he had hoped no one would notice or at least wouldn't challenge directly. Margaret was too smart and too careful to let such an obvious contradiction pass without investigation, especially now that they were partners and she had a vested interest in knowing who she was doing business with. He could lie again, add more layers to the deception, but he was tired of lying, and something about Margaret's directness made him want to tell her at least part of the truth. Jake set down his tools and turned to face Margaret fully, knowing that this moment had been inevitable from the start, that you couldn't build a partnership on lies without eventually having the foundation crack beneath you. "The truth is complicated," he said slowly, "and I'm not proud of all of it. But you deserve to know who you're doing business with." He told her about finding the hidden canyon, about Copper's injury leading him to water and salvation when he had been at his lowest point. He told her about the gold in Samuel Bridger's letter, about the mining company robbery 3 years ago and the dying man's confession. And he told her about his decision to take $200, convincing himself it was borrowing rather than stealing, promising himself he would return it someday when he could afford to. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face unreadable as Jake laid out the whole complicated truth. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for anger, for accusation, for the partnership to dissolve and possibly worse. But when she finally spoke, her words surprised him. "So you're a thief," she said flatly. "But not the kind who takes because he wants to, the kind who takes because he's desperate and trying to survive. That's different, though maybe not as different as you'd like it to be." "I know," Jake said quietly. "I've been trying to justify it to myself since the moment I took the money, but justifications don't change what I did. I stole from people who had already been victimized by a robbery, and then I used that stolen money to help you, which means I've made you part of my crime whether you wanted to be or not. I'm sorry for that." "Sorry isn't worth much," Margaret replied, "but neither is being so rigid in your morality that you starve to death in the desert rather than bend the rules to survive." Her expression softened slightly. "My husband used to say that the frontier was no place for people who couldn't adapt, who couldn't find the line between principle and pragmatism. You found that line, Jake. You could have taken all the gold, thousands of dollars, and disappeared. Instead, you took what you needed to survive and left the rest. That says something about your character. Jake felt something loosen in his chest, relief mixed with shame, mixed with gratitude that she was trying to understand rather than simply condemn. "But what do we do now?" he asked. "The money I gave you came from that theft, which means the bank payment was made with stolen funds. That could cause legal problems for both of us if it comes out." Margaret considered this, her practical mind already working through possibilities and consequences. "The way I see it, we have two choices," she said. "We can go to the authorities, confess everything, and hope they're merciful. That would probably mean losing the ranch because we'd have to return the money, and it might mean jail time for you. Or we can keep working, build this ranch into something profitable, and when we're successful enough, you find a way to return what you took to the mining company anonymously. Make restitution without destroying what we're building here." "It's not exactly legal," Jake pointed out. "No," Margaret agreed, "but it's not exactly evil either. You made a mistake born of desperation, and now you're trying to do right by people who need help. The world isn't always black and white, Jake. Sometimes we have to live in the gray spaces and trust that our intentions matter, even when our actions aren't perfect." They worked in silence for a while, both of them processing the implications of this conversation and the decision they were making together. Finally, Emily appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward them, and something about her urgency made them both stop working and watch her approach. "Mama, Jake," she called out as she reined in her horse. "Mr. Dalton is back at the house with the sheriff. He's saying you made the payment with fraudulent funds, that he has questions about where Jake got the money." Margaret and Jake exchanged a look, and Jake felt his stomach drop. Somehow the banker had found out or guessed enough to cause trouble. They rode back to the ranch house quickly, arriving to find Dalton looking smug and the sheriff looking uncomfortable. Sheriff Williams was a decent man who Jake had met briefly in town, someone who tried to be fair within the constraints of a system that often wasn't. "Mrs. Chambers," the sheriff said, tipping his hat respectfully, "I apologize for the intrusion, but Mr. Dalton has raised some concerns about the source of your recent payment. He claims that your new partner couldn't possibly have come by that much money, honestly, given his appearance when he arrived in town." Margaret's response was ice cold. "And since when does the bank get to investigate its customers rather than just accepting their payments? My understanding was that money is money, Sheriff. As long as it's legal tender, the source shouldn't matter to them." Dalton stepped forward, his expression triumphant. "Actually, Mrs. Chambers, the source matters very much when there's suspicion of criminal activity. I've done some research, and 3 years ago there was a significant robbery from the Copper Ridge Mining Company. The description of one of the thieves matches your Mr. Harrison quite closely." Jake felt the world narrow to a single point of decision. He could run, could try to escape before the accusations became charges. Or he could face this, whatever the consequences might be. Before he could speak, a rider appeared on the road approaching the ranch, and Jake's breath caught as he recognized Heinrich's distinctive figure on his sturdy draft horse. The veterinarian rode into the yard and dismounted with deliberate slowness, pulling an envelope from his saddlebag. "Sheriff Williams," he said, "I believe I have information relevant to this situation." He handed the envelope to the sheriff, who opened it and began reading with a frown of concentration. "This is a letter from the Copper Ridge Mining Company," the sheriff said after a moment. "They're stating that all funds from the robbery 3 years ago were recovered when they captured the remaining thief, a man named Jack Whelan, 6 months ago. They're declaring the case closed and all debts satisfied." Jake stared at Heinrich in confusion and dawning comprehension. The veterinarian met his eyes with a slight smile. "I took the liberty of writing to them on your behalf," he said quietly. "Described the hidden canyon you mentioned and suggested they might want to investigate. They sent their own people, found the remaining gold where you left it, and recovered it all. The letter thanks the anonymous source who reported the location and states that no further action will be pursued regarding any small amounts that might have been taken for survival purposes. Dalton's face had gone pale, his accusations collapsing beneath the weight of official documentation. The sheriff handed the letter back to Heinrich, then turned to the banker with evident satisfaction. "Seems your investigation was based on incorrect information, Mr. Dalton. I suggest you return to town and find better ways to spend your time than harassing honest ranchers." After they left, Jake sat on the porch steps, feeling as if his entire body might collapse from relief. Heinrich settled beside him with a quiet grunt. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning," the older man said. "I would have helped you find a way to make it right without all this drama. But you did the honorable thing in the end, leaving most of the gold for someone else to find and return. That counts for something." Margaret and Emily joined them, and for a while they all sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. The hidden stream had saved Jake's life, but it had also given him something more valuable than gold, a second chance to become the kind of man his father had tried to teach him to be. A man who made mistakes but tried to correct them, who compromised when necessary but never abandoned his core principles entirely. That evening at dinner, Margaret raised her glass of water in a toast. "To partnerships built on honesty," she said, "even when that honesty comes a little late. To second chances," Emily added, "and to hidden streams that lead us where we need to go." Jake finished, thinking of the canyon and the gold and the long, complicated path that had brought him to this table with these people who had become something like family. The Broken Creek Ranch had a future now, built on hard work and hope and the kind of redemption that came not from perfection, but from persistent effort to do better. Outside the window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and somewhere in those red rock canyons, a hidden stream continued to flow, waiting to save the next desperate soul who needed it most.